For nearly 1,000 years, Constantinople defied every enemy that stood before its walls. But in 1453, a young Ottoman sultan arrived with an army, giant cannons, and a single ambition: to conquer the city that had never truly fallen. The siege that followed would end the Byzantine Empire, close the final chapter of the Roman Empire, and change the course of world history forever. This is the story of the fall of Constantinople. For over a millennium, the massive fortifications of Constantinople stood as the unbreakable shield of the Roman East, projecting imperial authority across the Mediterranean world. As the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the city dictated the terms of global trade, preserved the administration of antiquity, and fielded armies that repelled successive waves of invaders from both Europe and Asia. Yet, by the middle of the 15th century, this once sprawling superpower had eroded into a mere shadow of its former dominion. The foundations of this collapse were not laid in a single sudden catastrophe, but through a long, agonizing process of internal fragmentation and external encirclement. The most devastating blow to the Byzantine state occurred centuries before the final siege, originating not from traditional adversaries in the east, but from fellow Christians in the west. In April 1204, the diverted armies of the Fourth Crusade breached the sea walls along the Golden Horn, unleashing a systematic sack of the city that shattered the imperial administration. Venetian galleys delivered waves of Frankish knights into the streets, where they stripped palaces of their gold, melted down ancient bronze monuments for coinage, and plundered the sacred relics of the Orthodox Church. According to the Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates, the Crusaders rode their horses directly into the Hagia Sophia, hacking apart the silver iconostasis and carrying off the wealth of generations. Although a Byzantine successor state, based in Nicaea, eventually recaptured Constantinople in 1261, the damage proved irreversible. The restored empire lacked the financial reserves to maintain a standing army or a formidable navy, forcing subsequent emperors to rely on expensive foreign mercenaries and grant crippling trade monopolies to the Italian maritime republics of Genoa and Venice. While the Byzantines struggled to reconstruct their ruined capital, a new and highly organized threat began to consolidate power in the east. Throughout the 14th century, the Ottoman Turks rapidly expanded across the Anatolian plateau, systematically stripping the empire of its most valuable eastern provinces. Under the leadership of Osman I and his son Orhan, nomadic Turkic warriors transitioned into a sophisticated military apparatus equipped with a professional infantry and a highly mobile cavalry. They bypassed the heavily fortified coastal cities, choosing instead to sever the logistical routes connecting the Byzantine outposts to the capital. One by one, the vital breadbaskets and recruiting grounds of Bithynia fell. Prusa surrendered in 1326, followed by the ancient ecclesiastical center of Nicaea in 1331 and Nicomedia in 1337. By driving the frontier all the way to the shores of the Sea of Marmara, Ottoman commanders permanently severed Constantinople from its Anatolian hinterland, depriving the imperial treasury of crucial tax revenues and grain supplies. Rather than immediately throwing their forces against the imposing land walls of the Byzantine capital, the Ottomans executed a grand strategic maneuver that would dictate the geopolitical reality of the next century. In 1354, a devastating earthquake shattered the walls of Gallipoli, a critical Byzantine fortress situated on the European side of the Dardanelles Straits. Seizing the opportunity, Ottoman forces crossed the water, occupied the ruined citadel, and established their first permanent foothold in Europe. Marching deep into the Balkans, they systematically bypassed Constantinople, projecting Ottoman military power into Thrace, Macedonia, and Bulgaria. In 1369, Sultan Murad I captured the major Thracian city of Adrianople, subsequently relocating the Ottoman capital there and renaming it Edirne. This maneuver effectively pushed the front lines hundreds of miles to the west of Constantinople, entirely encircling the Byzantine capital. Successive Christian coalitions attempted to halt this expansion, but Ottoman forces crushed the Serbian nobility at the Battle of Maritsa in 1371 and destroyed a massive Crusader army at Nicopolis in 1396. Surrounded by a hostile, expanding empire, Constantinople became an isolated island, completely cut off from the agricultural heartlands that had once sustained its massive population. Recognizing that his isolated capital could not survive without heavy military intervention, Emperor John VIII Palaiologos initiated a desperate diplomatic gamble. He understood that only the naval power of Venice and the heavy cavalry of the Western European kingdoms could break the Ottoman blockade. In 1437, John traveled to Italy with a large delegation of Orthodox clergy and theologians to negotiate a formal reunification of the Christian Church, which had been split since the Great Schism of 1054. At the Council of Florence in 1439, the emperor and his representatives debated complex theological doctrines regarding the procession of the Holy Spirit and the supremacy of the papacy. Driven by military necessity, John eventually capitulated to Catholic demands, signing a decree of union that officially subjected the Eastern Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope in Rome. The diplomatic concession secured promises of a new crusade, but it triggered a catastrophic political crisis upon the emperor's return to Constantinople. The Orthodox population, harboring deep generational trauma from the atrocities of the Fourth Crusade, fiercely rejected the union. Monks, parish priests, and ordinary citizens rioted in the streets, refusing to attend services conducted by unionist clergy. High-ranking officials openly defied the imperial decree, with the prominent scholar Mark of Ephesus leading a theological resistance that fractured the already fragile political unity of the city. Contemporary chronicles record that the Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, the highest-ranking minister in the imperial court, declared that he would rather see the Turkish turban reigning in the center of the city than the Latin mitre. This internal religious schism paralyzed the Byzantine administration, alienating the local populace from the imperial court precisely when absolute unified resistance was required. Amidst this atmosphere of religious division and geographic isolation, Constantine XI Palaiologos assumed the throne following the death of his brother in 1448. Unlike previous emperors who were crowned in the Hagia Sophia, Constantine received his imperial diadem in January 1449 within the provincial capital of Mistra, located deep in the Peloponnese. He arrived in Constantinople months later aboard a Catalan ship, taking command of a completely bankrupt empire. The territory under his direct control had been reduced to the city itself, a handful of sparsely populated Aegean islands, and the despotate of the Morea in southern Greece. The once magnificent capital had deteriorated into a series of disconnected villages separated by overgrown fields, ruined forums, and collapsed palaces. Its population, which had once exceeded 500,000, had dwindled to roughly 40,000 inhabitants. Constantine immediately assessed the crumbling defenses, attempting to reorganize the garrison and raise funds to repair the ancient Theodosian Walls. He dispatched envoys across the Mediterranean, pleading for shipments of grain, gunpowder, and mercenary companies to reinforce the severely undermanned fortifications. His diplomats carried urgent letters to Venice, Genoa, and Rome, warning that without immediate Western intervention, the last remnant of the Roman state would inevitably fall. Just across the border in Edirne, the old Ottoman Sultan passed away, placing the vast resources of a mobilized, militarized empire into the hands of a young, highly ambitious heir. In February 1451, Sultan Murad II died in the Ottoman capital of Edirne. Word of his death rapidly reached his son, who was stationed in the provincial governorate of Manisa. 19-year-old Mehmed II immediately mounted his horse, rode for the Dardanelles, and crossed into Europe to claim the Ottoman throne. Across the Christian courts of Europe, diplomats and monarchs received the news of the young sultan's accession with a cautious sense of relief. Contemporary chronicles report that Western ambassadors viewed the teenager as inexperienced, untested, and unlikely to pose a severe threat to the established geopolitical order. Mehmed actively cultivated this illusion. He renewed peace treaties with the Republic of Venice, the Kingdom of Hungary, and the Knights Hospitaller, projecting an image of a compliant monarch while secretly reorganizing his entire military command. Within his court, he marginalized cautious advisors, promoted aggressive military commanders to key positions, and secured his bloodline by ordering the execution of his infant half-brother. Once his borders were secure and his domestic rivals eliminated, Mehmed summoned his viziers and declared his absolute intent. He commanded his generals to prepare for the complete conquest of the Byzantine capital, spending his nights studying detailed maps of the city's fortifications and ancient siege treatises. To successfully lay siege to Constantinople, the Ottoman army first needed to sever its maritime lifelines. The Byzantine capital relied heavily on grain shipments flowing south from the Black Sea, navigated through the narrow, winding strait of the Bosphorus. In the spring of 1452, Mehmed mobilized thousands of masons, carpenters, and laborers, marching them to the European shore of the strait. He chose a highly strategic choke point just a few miles north of Constantinople, where the waterway narrows to less than 800 meters. Here, directly opposite an existing Ottoman fortress on the Anatolian side, Mehmed commanded the rapid construction of a massive new citadel. To ensure unprecedented speed, the Sultan assigned the construction of its 3 main towers to his top 3 viziers, establishing a fierce competition among them. Ottoman laborers dismantled ruined Byzantine churches and structures in the surrounding countryside, dragging the stone blocks to the construction site. Working relentlessly through the summer heat, the workforce completed the imposing fortress in just over 4 months. Mehmed named the installation Bogazkizan, the throat cutter, known today as Remelhisari. He immediately garrisoned the stronghold with 400 elite janissaries and mounted heavy bronze cannons on its lower battlements, angled to fire heavy stone balls just above the waterline. The Sultan issued a strict decree that every passing ship must lower its sails, approach the shore, and pay a toll. In November 1452, a Venetian merchant vessel commanded by Antonio Rizzo attempted to run the blockade. Ottoman gunners fired on the ship, instantly shattering its hull and sinking it. Rizzo and his surviving crew were pulled from the water, marched over 100 miles back to Edirne, and executed publicly as a warning to all foreign maritime powers. The Black Sea grain route was now entirely under Ottoman control, effectively placing the Byzantine capital under a naval chokehold. Watching the imposing towers of Remelhisari rise from his palace windows, Emperor Constantine XI recognized that a massive siege was imminent. The Byzantine ruler issued frantic, desperate appeals to Western Europe, warning that unless a major relief army mobilized immediately, the city would starve before the walls were even breached. He dispatched envoys to the Pope in Rome, the Senate of Venice, and the kings of Naples and Aragon, requesting shipments of wheat, saltpeter, and professional soldiers. The response was devastatingly minimal. France and England remained exhausted from the aftermath of the 100 Years' War. The German states were fractured by internal dynastic disputes, and the Italian maritime republics hesitated to provoke a war that would destroy their highly lucrative Eastern trade networks. Pope Nicholas V eventually sent a papal legate with a small detachment of archers and funds, but conditioned full military support on the complete enforcement of the religious union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches. Despite the political inaction of Western governments, individual commanders recognized the gravity of the Byzantine plight and mobilized at their own expense. In late January 1453, 2 Genoese galleys sailed through the Dardanelles and dropped anchor in the Golden Horn harbor. They carried a force of 700 heavily armored professional mercenaries, led by the experienced Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. Giustiniani brought skilled siege engineers, heavily armored infantrymen, crossbowmen, and troops trained in the tactical use of early handguns. Upon his arrival, Constantine immediately granted him the rank of protostrator, effectively making the Genoese mercenary the commander-in-chief of the city's land defenses. Justiniani wasted no time. He systematically inspected the ancient 14-mile perimeter of the Theodosian Walls, requisitioned materials to patch crumbling masonry, cleared debris from the defensive moat, and deployed his disciplined troops along the most vulnerable sections of the fortification. While Justiniani reinforced the medieval stonework, a revolution in military technology was taking shape in the Ottoman camp. Earlier in the year, a highly skilled cannon founder named Orban, identified in historical records as a Hungarian or Transylvanian engineer, had arrived in Constantinople. Orban offered to cast state-of-the-art bronze artillery for the Byzantine defense. Constantine eagerly received the engineer, but the imperial treasury was entirely empty. The Byzantine administration could barely afford to provide a meager daily stipend for Orban, let alone procure the massive quantities of raw bronze, copper, and timber required to cast and fuel the weapons. Frustrated, underfunded, and recognizing the financial collapse of the empire, Orban departed the Byzantine capital and traveled directly to the Ottoman court at Edirne in late 1452. Mehmed granted the engineer an immediate audience. When asked if he could cast a cannon capable of shattering the formidable walls of Constantinople, Orban assured the Sultan that his weapons could reduce the walls of Babylon itself to dust. Mehmed provided the engineer with an unlimited budget, vast foundries, and thousands of skilled laborers. Over the next several months, Orban produced a devastating arsenal of siege artillery. His metallurgical masterpiece was a colossal bombard, measuring over 27 feet in length with a solid bronze barrel wall 8 inches thick. During its initial test firing outside Edirne, the deafening roar of the weapon reportedly echoed for miles, propelling a stone ball weighing over 1,000 pounds deep into the earth. To transport this monstrous weapon to the siege lines, Ottoman engineers constructed a train of reinforced wooden wagons pulled by 60 oxen. A specialized contingent of 200 men marched ahead of the procession, laboring for weeks to reinforce wooden bridges and level the muddy dirt roads leading toward the Byzantine capital. Understanding the immense scale of the impending artillery bombardment and naval assault, the Byzantine defenders worked frantically to secure the city's weakest front. While the towering, triple-layered Theodosian walls protected the western landward approach, the sea walls running along the northern harbor of the Golden Horn were much lower, built in a single layer right at the water's edge. During the devastating Fourth Crusade, it was precisely these northern walls that Venetian galleys had successfully breached. To prevent Mehmed's rapidly expanding navy from executing a similar amphibious assault, Byzantine and Italian engineers implemented a massive defensive countermeasure to physically block the harbor entrance. In early 1453, harbor workers brought forth a colossal iron chain, forged from massive, heavy links that had been stored in the city's arsenals for decades. Using a network of large wooden rafts and floating log booms to support the staggering weight of the metal, workmen stretched the chain across the entire mouth of the Golden Horn harbor. One end was firmly anchored to the Tower of Eugenius on the Byzantine shore, while the other was secured to a fortified tower within the neutral Genoese colony of Pera on the northern bank. Once drawn taut by heavy mechanical winches, the iron barrier sat just at the waterline, presenting an impenetrable physical blockade to any ship attempting to sail into the harbor. Behind the chain, a small, heavily armed flotilla of Venetian and Byzantine war galleys formed a defensive line, ready to unleash Greek fire upon any Ottoman vessel that approached the barrier. With the harbor sealed, the defensive perimeter of the city locked into place. The gates of Constantinople were firmly shut, the civilian population retreated behind the ancient stonework, and the horizon darkened as the vanguard of the massive Ottoman army began pitching their tents across the plains of Thrace, bringing Orban's massive cannons into position just beyond the range of Byzantine arrows. Following their assembly in Edirne, the vanguard of the Turkish army began to pour across the Thracian plains in the early spring of 1453. By April 6th, the full might of the Ottoman military apparatus formally arrived outside the gates of Constantinople. The imperial army numbered between 80,000 and 100,000 troops, comprising highly disciplined Janissary infantry, armored Sipahi cavalry, and vast thousands of irregular Başibazuk conscripts. Sultan Mehmed II rode at the center of the host, ordering his generals to establish a continuous siege line stretching across the entire 14-mile perimeter of the land fortifications, from the shores of the Sea of Marmara to the muddy banks of the Golden Horn. The Sultan pitched his red and gold command tent directly opposite the Mesotikion, the central and most vulnerable section of the Byzantine land walls, where the Lycus River flowed into the city. Here, the Ottoman forces dug deep trench networks, erected wooden palisades to protect their advancing archers, and prepared reinforced firing positions for the massive siege train they had painstakingly hauled across the rugged terrain of Eastern Europe. The subsequent barrage fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. Mehmed II ordered his artillery corps to wheel their massive bronze cannons into position, directing the muzzles toward the ancient, triple-layered Theodosian Walls. For over 1,000 years, these colossal stone fortifications had defied every invading army, relying on sheer height, intricate flanking towers, and immense thickness to repel scaling ladders and heavy battering rams. Now, they faced a weapon that struck with unprecedented kinetic force. The Ottoman gunners loaded immense stone balls, some weighing up to 1,000 pounds, into Orban's great bombard and dozens of smaller artillery pieces arrayed along the siege line. When the Ottoman engineers touched their burning matches to the touch holes, the ensuing continuous bombardment shattered the medieval paradigm of defensive warfare. Contemporary chronicles report that the deafening roar of the guns could be heard across the Bosphorus, while the concussive force violently shook the ground within the city center. The massive stone projectiles slammed into the rigid masonry of the outer wall, violently fracturing the limestone and crushing the brickwork. Entire sections of the ancient parapets crumbled into the defensive moat, sending thick plumes of white dust drifting into the spring air and leaving gaping breaches in the once impregnable defenses. Despite the devastating initial damage, the defenders adapted rapidly to this terrifying new era of gunpowder warfare. Emperor Constantine XI and the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo immediately reorganized the city's civilian population into dedicated repair crews. As night fell and the overheated Ottoman cannons required hours to cool down, thousands of men, women, and monks rushed to the shattered sections of the outer wall carrying torches and raw materials. They did not attempt to rebuild the defensive line with rigid stone blocks. Instead, Giustiniani commanded his engineers to construct makeshift barricades using heavy wooden stakes, woven timber screens, tightly packed earth, and loose rubble gathered from ruined churches. This desperate improvisation inadvertently yielded a vastly superior defense against the heavy artillery. When the Ottoman bombardment resumed the following dawn, the massive stone balls struck the newly erected earthen ramparts rather than rigid masonry. Rather than shattering the structure, the soft earth and timber absorbed the kinetic energy of the heavy projectiles, smothering the impact and effectively neutralizing the devastating penetrative power of the cannons. The relentless cycle of daytime bombardment and frantic nighttime reconstruction settled into a grueling, bloody war of attrition along the entirety of the land walls. Frustrated by the surprising resilience of the earthen defenses, Mehmed II sought to stretch the Byzantine lines to their absolute breaking point by opening a second front on the water. The Sultan ordered his naval commander, Süleyman Baltaylu, to break the defensive perimeter of the Golden Horn and force his fleet into the northern harbor. Baltaylu commanded an armada of over 100 Ottoman vessels, a formidable fleet of fast galleys, fustas, and transport ships. They rowed fiercely toward the massive iron chain that stretched across the harbor entrance, initiating repeated frontal assaults against the barrier. However, the Ottoman galleys were built primarily for speed and shallow coastal waters, sitting extremely low in the water. Behind the thick iron chain stood a formidable defensive line of towering Venetian and Genoese war galleys. The Christian sailors used their significant height advantage to devastating effect. From the towering forecastles of their ships, Italian crossbowmen fired directly down onto the exposed Ottoman decks, piercing armor and pinning rowers to their benches. Simultaneously, Byzantine engineers hurled clay pots filled with volatile Greek fire, instantly engulfing the advancing wooden hulls in inextinguishable flames. Unable to breach the heavy chain or overcome the heavier Western ships in close combat, Baltelu was repeatedly forced to order a humiliating retreat back into the choppy waters of the Bosphorus. The Ottoman naval blockade faced an even greater humiliation merely 2 weeks into the brutal siege. On the morning of April 20th, a small flotilla suddenly appeared on the horizon of the Sea of Marmara, driving straight toward the besieged city. The fleet consisted of 3 heavy Genoese war galleys hired by Pope Nicholas V, accompanied by a large Byzantine transport ship heavily laden with Sicilian grain, armor, weapons, and desperately needed reinforcing troops. Recognizing the critical threat this supply drop posed to his starvation strategy, Mehmed II rowed immediately to the shoreline and ordered Baltelu to intercept and destroy the Christian vessels at all costs. Over 100 Ottoman ships swarmed out to meet the 4 isolated vessels. As the opposing fleets closed the distance, the wind suddenly died, leaving the massive, heavy Christian ships becalmed in the treacherous, swirling currents of the Bosphorus. The smaller, maneuverable, oar-powered Ottoman galleys rapidly surrounded them, locking their hulls against the flanks of the Christian ships and aggressively attempting to board the stalled vessels. A brutal, close-quarters naval battle rapidly erupted in the narrow straits. The Genoese and Byzantine sailors, vastly outnumbered, fought desperately from their towering wooden decks. They hacked away grappling hooks with heavy axes, fired armor-piercing projectiles into the dense throngs of Turkish sailors, and poured boiling pitch directly onto the swarming Ottoman infantry attempting to scale the wooden sides of their ships. The heavy plate armor and disciplined pike formations of the Italian mercenaries held the defensive line against wave after wave of fierce Turkish boarders. For hours, the 4 ships drifted helplessly on the surface current, locked in desperate hand-to-hand combat, slowly drifting dangerously close to the Ottoman-held European shoreline where Mehmed II watched furiously from horseback. According to contemporary accounts, the young sultan became so violently enraged by the inability of his massive armada to sink the heavily laden transport that he spurred his horse directly into the shallow coastal waters, screaming tactical orders and furious curses at his beleaguered admiral over the din of the battle. Just as the Christian defenders reached the absolute limits of their physical endurance, the wind unexpectedly shifted and rapidly increased in strength. The heavy square sails of the Genoese and Byzantine vessels caught the sudden gust, violently propelling their massive wooden hulls forward. The sudden, overwhelming forward momentum shattered the Ottoman encirclement, snapping thick boarding lines and violently tossing the smaller Turkish galleys aside. With their sails fully billowing and their heavy oars working in unison, the 4 ships broke completely free from the deadly engagement, aggressively navigating through the scattering Ottoman fleet. They sailed directly toward the safety of the Golden Horn. As dusk settled over the besieged city, the Byzantine engineers frantically lowered the heavy iron chain just enough to allow the battered flotilla to pass, immediately raising it back into its locked position behind them. The successful delivery of fresh professional troops and massive quantities of food provided a critical, immediate surge in morale for the exhausted defenders of Constantinople, proving that the Ottoman blockade could indeed be broken. The catastrophic failure to stop a mere 4 ships humiliated the Ottoman high command and deeply infuriated the young sultan. Mehmed II immediately stripped Baltelu of his rank, confiscated his extensive personal property, and ordered his public flogging in front of the assembled troops. The Sultan realized that relying on brute force to break the harbor chain or defeat the towering Western ships in open water was a failing strategy. If the Ottoman army was to stretch the Byzantine defenders thin enough to successfully breach the land walls, they absolutely had to project overwhelming naval power into the Golden Horn. Staring across the dark waters toward the neutral Genoese colony of Pera, Mehmed II fixated his attention on the steep, densely forested Galata Hill that rose directly behind the European settlement, formulating an audacious engineering solution to bypass the impenetrable iron chain. Following the failure of his fleet to shatter the Christian naval blockade, Sultan Mehmed II faced a severe tactical dilemma. The massive iron chain stretched across the Golden Horn completely denied his ships access to the vulnerable northern sea walls of Constantinople. As long as the Byzantine defenders could concentrate their limited manpower exclusively along the battered land walls, they could repair the artillery breaches faster than the Ottomans could exploit them. To stretch the exhausted garrison to its breaking point, the Ottoman High Command needed to project naval power directly into the protected harbor. Mehmed devised an audacious engineering solution to bypass the physical barrier entirely. He ordered his military engineers to construct a massive overland portage route, designed to physically drag an entire fleet of warships across the steep, densely forested Galata Hill, circumventing the iron chain and the Christian flotilla guarding the waterway. The proposed route spanned roughly a mile and a half, originating at the Bosphorus shore, climbing a steep 200-foot elevation directly behind the neutral Genoese colony of Pera, and descending into the Valley of the Springs on the shores of the Golden Horn. Throughout mid-April, thousands of Ottoman laborers and sappers systematically cleared the thick brush, leveled the uneven terrain, and laid down a continuous track constructed from heavy wooden planks. To ensure the galleys could slide up the steep incline without splintering their wooden keels, engineers slaughtered hundreds of oxen and sheep, rendering massive quantities of animal fat to heavily grease the wooden rails. To conceal this massive engineering project from the Genoese merchants residing in Pera and the Byzantine sentries stationed on the city walls, Mehmed commanded his artillery corps to maintain a continuous, blinding bombardment against the chain and the sea walls throughout the day and night. The extraordinary portage operation commenced before dawn on April 22nd. Ottoman crews hoisted the shallow draft fustas and galleys out of the Bosphorus waters, resting their hulls onto wheeled wooden cradles fitted precisely to the greased tracks. Teams of oxen, chained together in long files, provided the primary pulling force, while thousands of Turkish soldiers pushed alongside the ships to maintain balance and forward momentum. Contemporary chronicles report a surreal spectacle as the warships moved steadily over the dry land, with sailors sitting on the rowing benches beating drums, blowing trumpets, and sweeping their oars through the empty air to coordinate the strenuous pulling efforts of the labor crews. By the end of the day, Ottoman forces successfully hauled over 70 warships over the crest of the Galata Hill and slid them directly into the waters of the Golden Horn. The sudden appearance of an enemy armada within the supposedly impenetrable harbor devastated the Byzantine defensive strategy. When Emperor Constantine XI looked out from the Blachurni Palace at dawn, he saw a fully operational Ottoman fleet anchored safely behind his defensive chain, rapidly establishing a wooden pontoon bridge across the upper reaches of the estuary. The emperor was forced into a desperate tactical realignment. He immediately ordered his commanders to redeploy hundreds of heavily armored infantry, Venetian crossbowmen, and skilled Byzantine archers away from the heavily bombarded land walls, transferring them to guard the long, single-layered northern sea walls. This frantic redistribution dangerously thinned the already depleted Byzantine lines along the Western Front, leaving far fewer men to repel the relentless Ottoman infantry assaults and repair the massive masonry breaches along the Mesopotamian. The defensive perimeter was now stretched to its absolute breaking point, exactly as the Sultan had calculated. While the naval maneuver stretched the defenders horizontally across the surface, a hidden claustrophobic war simultaneously erupted deep underground. Seeking to bypass the resilient earthen barricades altogether, Mehmed II deployed specialized mining teams consisting largely of Serbian conscripts drawn from the silver mines of Novo Brdo. These men possessed generations of experience extracting precious metals from deep within the earth. In mid-May, these expert sappers began excavating a network of subterranean tunnels originating far beyond the Byzantine defensive moat, aiming to dig completely beneath the foundations of the land walls near the Caligari quarter. The Ottomans dug silently in the damp earth, supporting the tunnel roofs with heavy timber props. They intended to pack the underground chambers with volatile gunpowder or ignite the wooden supports, aiming to collapse the ancient stone foundations above and create a massive, undefendable breach for the awaiting Turkish infantry. The Byzantine defenders quickly detected the subterranean threat. Constantine XI appointed Johannes Grant, a skilled Scottish or German siege engineer serving with the Genoese contingents, to command a specialized countermining unit. Grant ordered his men to place small bowls of water on the ground near the inner walls, closely watching for tiny ripples on the surface to pinpoint the exact location and direction of the enemy digging. Once a Turkish tunnel was located, the Byzantine sappers rapidly excavated their own interception shafts. Breaking through the earthen walls into the Ottoman tunnels in the pitch black, Grant's troops engaged the Serbian miners in brutal, suffocating hand-to-hand combat using pickaxes and short swords. The countermining teams successfully neutralized the subterranean threat by flooding the intercepted shafts with water, collapsing the roofs with calculated powder explosions, and aggressively pumping blinding smoke and Greek fire into the narrow corridors to incinerate the enemy sappers. By late May, the Byzantines had intercepted and destroyed every single Ottoman tunnel, temporarily securing the physical foundations of the city. Despite achieving tactical victories underground, the psychological endurance of the civilian population suffered a catastrophic blow from the heavens. On the night of May 24th, a total lunar eclipse cast the besieged city into deep, unnatural darkness. According to a long-held ancient prophecy, the city of Constantinople would never fall as long as the moon was waxing. As the full moon turned a deep, blood-red color and slowly vanished from the night sky, widespread panic gripped the Orthodox population. Believing the eclipse signaled the final withdrawal of divine protection, priests and citizens organized a solemn religious procession through the shattered streets the following morning, carrying the most sacred icon of the Virgin Mary, the Hodegetria. As the procession advanced, a sudden thunderstorm broke over the city. The icon unexpectedly slipped from its wooden platform, crashing violently into the mud. When frantic citizens attempted to lift the heavy portrait, they found it inexplicably pinned to the earth, requiring a massive collective effort to move it. Torrential rains and thick fog immediately swallowed the city, convincing the exhausted defenders that their doom was unequivocally sealed. Sensing the collapse of Byzantine morale and the physical exhaustion of the defending garrison, Mehmed II initiated a final diplomatic maneuver. He dispatched an envoy across the decimated no-man's land, carrying a formal ultimatum directly to the Byzantine court. The young sultan demanded the immediate, unconditional surrender of Constantinople. In exchange, he offered Emperor Constantine XI safe passage to the Peloponnese, where he could continue to rule the despotate of the Morea as an Ottoman vassal. Furthermore, Mehmed guaranteed the lives, property, and religious freedom of all citizens who chose to remain in their homes, while allowing those who wished to depart to leave unmolested with their portable wealth. If the offer was rejected, the Sultan promised to subject the city to a traditional 3-day sack, enslaving the population and reducing the ancient capital to ashes in accordance with traditional laws of war regarding cities taken by force. Constantine XI received the Ottoman envoy within his command tent, fully aware that his defensive lines were barely holding together and that no Western relief army was coming to his aid. the emperor drafted a categorical rejection of the surrender terms. In his written response, he acknowledged the sultan's overwhelming military power and offered to pay any annual tribute within his meager financial means, but he adamantly refused to hand over the imperial capital. Constantine declared that to surrender the city was not his prerogative, nor the prerogative of any of its inhabitants, and that they had all mutually resolved to die of their own free will rather than abandon their home. The Byzantine ruler formally dismissed the envoy, returning to the battered ramparts of the Theodosian Walls to stand alongside his remaining soldiers. Upon receiving this defiant response, Mehmed II immediately ordered his commanders to cease all artillery fire, silence the war drums, and begin distributing final tactical instructions for a coordinated general assault against every section of the Byzantine defenses. Shortly after midnight on May 29, 1453, the oppressive silence hanging over the battered Theodosian walls violently shattered. Sultan Mehmed II initiated the final general assault, coordinating a massive, multi-tiered offensive designed to completely exhaust the numerically inferior Byzantine garrison. He ordered his commanders to send the army forward in 3 distinct, relentless waves, ensuring the defenders received no opportunity to rest, rearm, or repair the shattered timber barricades. The first wave consisted of the irregular Bashibazuks, thousands of lightly armed conscripts who charged across the darkness toward the ruined Mesotikian sector, carrying heavy wooden scaling ladders. The Christian defenders poured concentrated crossbow fire and primitive musket volleys into their dense, disorganized ranks, inflicting horrific casualties. Byzantine engineers hurled clay pots filled with Greek fire, incinerating hundreds of attackers in the dry moat. The irregulars fought frantically for 2 grueling hours before Mehmed ordered their withdrawal, leaving the defensive trenches choked with their dead. Before the Byzantine and Italian troops could recover their breath or extinguish the flames, the Sultan launched his second wave. Heavily armored Anatolian regular infantry advanced in tight, disciplined formations, supported by concentrated artillery fire that pounded the fragile earthen ramparts. The Anatolians hurled grappling hooks over the stockades, attempting to tear down the wooden palisades by sheer force. The combat deteriorated into vicious hand-to-hand fighting in the darkness, with heavily armed men slipping in the mud and blood along the narrow defensive perimeter. For hours, the exhausted defenders held the line, repelling the Anatolian assault just as dawn began to break over the horizon. Recognizing that the garrison was now pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance, Mehmed II personally led his elite third wave, the Janissaries, to the edge of the moat. Marching in perfect discipline to the rhythmic beating of war drums, the veteran heavy infantry charged the weakest sections of the defenses, engaging the surviving defenders in brutal, close-quarters combat with heavy maces and curved swords. During this relentless third wave, the defense suffered a fatal physical and psychological blow. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who had personally anchored the defense of the land walls for weeks, sustained a severe wound. A heavy lead projectile pierced his armor, striking him deep in the chest and causing massive blood loss. Bleeding profusely, struggling to breathe, and unable to stand, Giustiniani ordered his personal bodyguard to carry him away from the intense front line and evacuate him to a waiting Genoese ship in the harbor. Emperor Constantine XI, fighting nearby amidst the dust and smoke, desperately pleaded with the commander to remain at his post, knowing that his departure would shatter the fragile morale of the Italian mercenaries. The wounded commander refused, and his men carried him through the inner gates, locking them behind him. When the Genoese troops saw their veteran leader abandoning the barricades, their combat discipline instantly collapsed. Panic swept through the Italian ranks. Hundreds of heavily armored mercenaries broke formation, abandoning the critical defensive breaches and fleeing toward the Golden Horn to secure passage on the surviving Venetian and Genoese galleys. As the defensive line in the Lycus Valley rapidly disintegrated, a simultaneous disaster unfolded further north along the fortifications. During a previous counterattack, Byzantine troops had utilized a small, semi-hidden postern gate known as the Kirka Porta, located where the ancient land walls met the complex defenses of the Blachurni Palace. In the chaos of the shifting front lines and the deafening roar of the artillery, the defenders accidentally left this heavy wooden door entirely unsecured. An advanced detachment of Ottoman irregulars discovered the unlocked gate, immediately pushing it open and slipping directly behind the main Byzantine defensive perimeter. 50 Ottoman soldiers secured the adjacent watchtower, striking down the unsuspecting Byzantine sentries from behind. They swiftly raised the Ottoman standard over the inner wall, signaling to the main army that the supposedly impenetrable defenses had finally been breached from within. Seeing the enemy flag flying above the Blachurni and watching the Janissaries pour over the abandoned Genoese barricades, Emperor Constantine XI realized the city was unequivocally lost. With his defensive perimeter entirely compromised and enemy troops swarming into the streets behind his position, the emperor refused to be taken alive or live as a captive monarch. He unfastened his heavy purple imperial cloak, discarded the golden insignias of his rank, and drew his sword. Accompanied by his closest nobleman and his cousin Theophilus, Constantine charged directly into the encroaching ranks of the Ottoman heavy infantry. He perished in the ensuing melee, cutting down several attackers before falling under the Ottoman blades, his body becoming permanently lost among the thousands of dead piling up along the ruined stockades. With the emperor dead and the military command structure completely eradicated, Ottoman soldiers poured into the city through multiple massive breaches along the land walls. They immediately initiated a massive, systematic sack of the Byzantine capital. Turkish troops battered down the heavy bronze doors of monasteries, palaces, and merchant houses, capturing thousands of terrified citizens seeking refuge. A massive crowd of civilians had barricaded themselves inside the Hagia Sophia, praying for divine deliverance. The Ottoman troops smashed through the great doors of the cathedral, capturing priests at the altar and systematically looting essential religious and historical artifacts. They stripped the gold and silver from holy icons, tore embroidered silk tapestries from the walls, and melted down ancient chalices. Thousands of civilians were bound together with ropes and chains, marched out of the city, and deported to be sold in the slave markets of Anatolia and the broader Islamic world. By the late afternoon, Sultan Mehmed II rode his white horse through the shattered gate of Chrysius, formally entering the conquered city under his new absolute authority. He proceeded directly through the smoke-filled streets to the Hagia Sophia, the massive cathedral that had served as the spiritual center of the Eastern Orthodox world for nearly a millennium. Upon entering the great church, the Sultan witnessed an Ottoman soldier actively hacking at the ancient marble floors to extract hidden wealth. Mehmed decisively halted the looting, striking the soldier with his sword and declaring that the buildings and monuments now belonged to the Sultan alone. He ordered a senior imam to step up to the high altar and deliver the Islamic call to prayer, initiating the immediate conversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque and symbolically claiming the physical heart of Byzantine Christianity. Mehmed II wasted no time in reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the region. He officially relocated the capital of the Ottoman Empire from Edirne to the newly captured city, initiating massive reconstruction projects to repopulate and rebuild the devastated urban center. To legitimize his rule over the millions of Orthodox Christians now under his dominion, the young Sultan claimed the title of Kaiser-i Rum, the Caesar of Rome. By adopting this specific title, Mehmed asserted himself not merely as a foreign conqueror, but as the direct, legitimate successor to the Roman imperial legacy, uniting Islamic and Roman traditions under his absolute command. The fall of Constantinople fundamentally altered the global economic system. For centuries, the Byzantine capital had acted as the primary bridge for overland trade routes connecting Europe to the highly lucrative spice and silk markets of Asia. With the Ottomans now exercising absolute control over the Bosphorus and the eastern Mediterranean, they imposed heavy taxes and severe restrictions on Christian merchants attempting to pass through their territory. This sudden severing of traditional land trade routes caused widespread economic panic in the merchant hubs of the West. Seeking to bypass the Ottoman monopoly, European monarchs and navigators began heavily investing in aggressive maritime exploration, desperately searching for alternative oceanic routes to India and China, a geopolitical shift that significantly accelerated the eventual age of discovery. Simultaneously, the collapse of the Byzantine state triggered a profound intellectual migration that permanently reshaped Western European culture. As the Ottoman armies closed in, and immediately following the sack of the city, hundreds of Byzantine scholars, theologians, astronomers, and linguists fled across the Adriatic Sea to the Italian city-states. They brought with them highly valuable ancient Greek manuscripts, including the unedited works of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer, many of which had been completely lost to the West during the turbulent Middle Ages. The arrival of these Greek scholars and their intact private libraries heavily fueled the intellectual development of the Renaissance, providing the foundational texts that inspired a radical rebirth in European art, philosophy, and empirical science. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople marked the definitive end of the Roman Empire, exactly 1,480 years after its foundational establishment by Emperor Augustus in 27 BC. The unbroken chain of imperial administration, Roman law, and Hellenistic culture that had survived the catastrophic fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century finally shattered under the bombardment of Ottoman artillery. The ancient political entity that had once stretched from the moors of Scotland to the deserts of Syria ceased to exist, replaced entirely by a rapidly expanding Islamic superpower firmly planted on the European continent. With the Byzantine buffer state completely eradicated from the map, the Christian kingdoms of Eastern Europe suddenly found themselves exposed as the new, immediate front lines against the Ottoman military machine. The Kingdom of Hungary and the Principality of Wallachia now faced a highly militarized, immensely wealthy empire with an unobstructed path into the heart of the Balkans. Sultan Mehmed II, having successfully digested the remnants of Rome, immediately mobilized his veteran armies and directed his vast siege train north, marching toward the heavily fortified fortress of Belgrade to crush the remaining resistance along the Danube River. And so, after nearly 15 centuries, the Roman Empire finally came to an end, not with a grand farewell, but with the fall of its last great city. Constantinople had stood against countless enemies for over 1,000 years, yet on that spring morning in 1453, history turned a page that could never be reopened. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd be honored to have you join me for the next journey into the past. Until then, take care and have a peaceful night. If history fascinates you, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting to be told.